All right. Well, welcome to the Heart Work with Marty Martin. Thank you for being here. It's the Heart Work, celebrating our racial diversity while building and fostering racial harmony, one conversation at a time. And we know that heart work is hard work, but it's not impossible. And so I'm glad to have with me today as my guest, Captain Laszlo Wasik. Did I get that right?
You
All
did.
right.
That's good.
All right. And we're here today talking about law enforcement and citizen relationships, building and fostering relationships with all citizens that they protect and serve. And so glad to have you with us today, Captain Wasik, and just looking forward to a great conversation on today. So let's get started with you just telling us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you got involved in law enforcement.
Well, thanks, Marty. I really appreciate being here. First of all, you caught me in the middle of my vacation. That's why I'm sporting this beard here. Normally I have a beard, but the beard reminds me every day to relax when you're on
That's
vacation.
right. That's right.
Uh, so I know we shared some stories before, and I told you. So I'm a first generation um, Hungarian, actually. So basically, my parents immigrated to this country in 1950. They actually spent some time in a refugee camp in Europe after the war. They got sponsored and came directly to San Diego. So I'm a native San Diegan. I was born in San Diego. Went to school here, college. Uh, my draw to law enforcement, I've always had a sense of service, and I think it's just my natural personality. I enjoy problem solving. I enjoy helping people. And I think that really drew me to law enforcement because you do have to problem solve every day. No 2 days are alike. I like the aspect of the being not stuck behind a desk all day, uh, having a monotonous job where you are doing the same thing over and over again. And with that said, I get a lot of satisfaction out of it. It truly helping people get through whatever woes they have. And usually when people come in contact with law enforcement, they're in their worst day, or they're going through something really tough, whether it's a traffic accident or having been burglarized or having been victimized by a crime. And hopefully you're there to comfort them, maybe give them some comfort and hope that they'll get through this. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that's really primarily my drive, and I do get a lot of satisfaction out of the job primarily for that.
Awesome, awesome. So you came in with a sense of service, a servant's attitude, a servant leadership attitude, in coming into the profession, and that's awesome. And I think that's so important in your profession as you interact with the people in the communities that you serve. Um, our conversation today was prompted by the current state of affairs regarding social justice issues and racial relations between police officers and the communities they serve, particularly the communities of color. My son Nick had shared with me his very candid and meaningful conversation he had with you as he began engaging in peaceful protest and for racial justice and equality post the George Floyd death. And would you mind sharing some of your conversation you had with Nicholas regarding your experiences as a police officer and as it relates to racial relationships within the community?
Sure. So I know your son and my daughter were friends in high school. They're still friends now. That's where they met. And after the George Floyd killing, I know that your son reached out to me, and very touchingly, he actually wrote me a personalized note. Actually brought me flowers, which was incredible. He's an incredible young man, and basically told me he understands and he's out there and he hears me, or he hears what's going on, and he wanted to make sure that there's communication between uh, law enforcement and the citizenry, and especially people of color.
Mm-hmm.
He shared some really kind of heart wrenching stories just about his own personal experiences. He's growing up a person of color, and the struggles he's had, and the hoops he's had to go through just for regular daily life, whether it's shopping or driving down the street. And not having had those experiences, it really opened my eyes, and I really felt for him that sometimes if we don't know, or we haven't walked in somebody else's shoes, it's really hard to have some empathy for people. And I think, like I shared a story with you. There was a gentleman I wrote about, or that I read about, who a good friend of his became disabled and was bound to a wheelchair. And his friend, as a showing solidarity with him, spent the whole day in a wheelchair just to see what his experiences were. And that's kind of a good example of that. Unless we truly are immersed ourselves in somebody else's shoes, really, truly, like you say, do the heart work and really find out what other people's struggles are and what they have to do day in and day out just to survive. Without that, we can't have empathy. And I think that if we don't know where we came from or where history will repeat itself if we make the same mistakes, if we don't understand our past and try to fix it. I think I'm going off on a tangent here, but primarily our conversation with Nick, he came over to spend some time here at my house. We sat out in the backyard. My entire family was there. So it was a joint conversation. But I was very moved. I was very moved by his gesture, by him, reaching out to me, and he knows it was a hard time. Law enforcement has been very vilified here recently, and it's hard to nobody wants to be painted with the same brush, obviously.
Right.
What happens across the country and some other parts of the country, reflects on everybody here. So when you have one law enforcement officer that does something wrong, as we noticed with the George Floyd incident, we all get painted with that same brush, and it hurts. And one of those that your son recognized that and reached out to me, and I really appreciated that. That was a really fine gesture on his part.
Yeah, because right now we're not just dealing with a black issue, we're dealing with a black and a blue issue right now. And we have to understand, just as much as African Americans, blacks, we don't like being painted with the same brush and stereotyped. We can't do that for our police officers either. We know that there are people who make mistakes that are black, white, red, yellow, brown, doesn't matter. And we know that there are police officers who make mistakes, but that doesn't mean all police officers are bad and that all police officers are racist. And so we want to be careful and cognizant of that. And we know that there does need to be some reform and some things done within our law enforcement. And that's just a part of always constantly learning and getting better at what we do, regardless of our profession or our vocation. We always want to get better. Les Brown has a saying that we can always better our best. And so as we have this opportunity now to reflect on how law enforcement is served in our communities, this is an opportunity for us all to grow, both our law enforcement officers as well as citizens, in building these relationships. And so that's why this conversation is so important. And I'm glad my son reached out to you. He has a big heart. And as I said, we try not to put everyone in the same box. Just because one person offended us doesn't mean everyone that's in that same cultural group or racial group or vocation or career is the same. And so I'm glad that he reached out to you and that you were willing to have the conversation with him. And that's what the heart work is about, is people taking time to have the conversation, because we haven't had these conversations openly. As I shared with you recently, that you're the second white gentleman that has ever had a candid conversation with me about white privilege and things like that. We haven't had these conversations. So I'm glad that now we're in a place where we're having these conversations, we're asking the hard questions, and we're doing some self-examination so that we can continue to grow and get better. And so thank you so much for that. And with all that said, what are some of the proactive things that police departments have done to help build and foster meaningful relationships with communities of color?
Yeah, so Marty, as we talked about before, is that we recruit from the citizenry. So, when you recruit from the citizen, you get a reflection of what the citizens are thinking and what their collective experience and then maybe their individual experiences are. And so recruiting is probably one of the keys to creating a department that reflects the community itself, and then also that you want to make sure you pick the right people who are in it for the right reasons. And I know law enforcement has come a long way. I first started out in the early 80s in a larger agency as a reserve officer. It took a few years of hiatus and then started full time about 24 years ago. And I've noticed that law enforcement has made magnificent strides in trying to reach that goal. Now, obviously, like any other organization, we're not perfect, and I think it's actually really good to actually self-examine and re-examine ourselves every so often. When you know better, you do better. And I think just in general, I mean, our jobs are always changing, whether it's the new laws come on the books, technology, what have you. There's always change. And if you're not willing to embrace the change and move with the change and change with the times, like you said too, always stay green, right? Because once you ripen, there's nowhere else to go but to rot.
Right.
So always be curious, and this is things that I'm a pretty curious person myself, and I always want to know why things are happening this way. And I think, like I mentioned before, is that as law enforcement officers, it's really important for us to know where we came from. I always encourage our younger officers to read books on the past and just kind of know, as law enforcement, really, we are here to maintain the status quo. So we're essentially enforcing the rules of the time. And, I encourage them to watch movies such as Selma, historical documentations of true events, and to see, when you see the brutalization of people of color by white officers wearing the same uniform I am, it really sets a message going, hey, this used to be our past. And look at these officers were brutal to people who all they really wanted was a seat at the table or a vote, and that's where we came from. So we have to understand that, so that we understand where people came from, how history has painted what officers were like, and that we know that we don't want to repeat that. We don't want to go back. We want to move forward. Part of the training we have done is the bias-based policing training, de-escalation training, and these are all evolving as we speak. And I've seen some great strides. I've had the privilege of serving with some outstanding men and women in uniform who have dedicated their lives to this job. And obviously there are a few, as they say, bad apples. And I think our goal is to, like with any other profession, as we talked about this too, it's hard to get rid of people who may not have, are not reaching the full potential that we expect of them, whether they're teachers, doctors, or cops. And but the vast majority of people that are in law enforcement today are there because they care, because they would not last if they did not care, because the job is so demanding. And over time, with the defunding, let's say, of social programs in the last few years, it has all fallen on law enforcement now. So whether it's the mental illness, homelessness, drug addiction, and what ends up happening is that by the time people are in a crisis to where they call the police, sometimes they do very violent things, even though, say, mental illness is not a crime, but when they get into a mental state where they do start harming people, including themselves, law enforcement gets called, and then we end up having to take care of the issue. And sometimes it does become violent, and it's unfortunate, but we're the ones that are called. We're the kind of the last resort, so to speak. I think that this re-examining of what the role in law enforcement is in our community is probably not a bad thing. I think there's probably some alternative solutions. Take this mask with the coronavirus now, with this mask wearing, and how controversial it is. And law enforcement is expected to enforce those laws. Here, it's a health order, a health issue, and then you're sending an armed person out there to try to get people to wear a mask. And with the laws are so they're written so that there's a lot of loopholes, if you want to say, if you have a health issue or something else that would prevent you from wearing it. It's almost an impossible law to enforce. You have pressure from both sides. Hey, enforce it, and then we're getting pressure from other people saying, hey, you can't do this, it's unconstitutional and whatnot. So we get caught in the middle. And we find ourselves like that often. We are the enforcers of the status quo of what currently happens to be the laws that have been established by our elected officials.
And so it sounds like in terms of being proactive and helping to build and foster meaningful relationships with those communities, you guys recruit from within the community, you go through training, bias training, and also training in areas of mental health. And I believe we had talked too that you've had some cultural relation training too, and you had shared an experience where you had pulled over a taxi driver, I think, from the Middle East. You want to share that story and how
Sure.
you de-escalate that situation?
Yeah, so I mean, our country is founded by immigrants. I am a prime example of that. I'm a first generation here. So, and so as people immigrate to this country, they bring along some of their customs and their traditions, and then their fears as well as what experiences they had in their own home country relating to law enforcement. And frankly, in many countries around the world, law enforcement is fairly corrupt and can't be trusted. And I think people bring those fears with them here. So I had stopped a cab driver who was from the Middle East, and at the end of the contact, I asked him to sign the citation. And as we all know, the citation, all it really, when you sign the citation, all it is a promise to appear in court and has nothing to do with guilt. But he refused to sign it. He did not want to sign it. And as we had learned in our cultural diversity classes, is that in some countries there, when you sign something, you're actually signing that you are guilty, and that could lead to some pretty severe punishment. So I understood why this guy was reluctant to do that. So knowing this, I just told him, hey, call somebody that you trust, call somebody that you know, and ask them what to do. And so he made a quick phone call. I presume he called his boss or somebody that he trusted, and without saying a word, he turned around, got off the phone, and he signed the citation. He's on his way. Now, the flip side of that is, we could just arrested him, towed his car, and create a potentially dangerous situation where you have to go hands-on with somebody just over the mere fact of some not understanding the culture of another person's past history and what experiences they've had. So I think just things like that is knowing where people have come from, and that includes people who have lived in this country for many years, especially people of color who experience a different life than me, for example. And like I told you, part of it is that I have my own story. Was my parents told me the story is that when they came to this country first, because they were white and because they were Christian, they were actually Catholics, they were afforded privileges that people of color who've lived here for generations did not have. My parents were allowed to live anywhere they wanted to, buy anywhere they wanted to. The real estate agent even told them the demarcation line in San Diego happened to be the 94 freeway. So, people of color weren't allowed to live north of that freeway. I benefited from that. Like I told you, is that, my parents were allowed to buy a home in probably more of an area that saw a significant rise in the property value, which subsequently, you got to pass on to your kids. So my parents to build equity and gave me money to buy my first house, at least a down payment, and I'm living in the house today because of that. I have my own personal story as a first generation. The fact that this country does have some ugly past that I think that people need to understand.
Yeah,
So,
and even here in San Diego, even here on the West Coast.
Here in San Diego, absolutely. So, and that's the reality of it. I think people need to understand that. And now, we are here today in 2020, but it's all based on the past and how it has built over the years. And I think that people really need to understand the truth in history and what really has happened to be able to move forward and at least have some empathy, to have some understanding, so that we can move forward and work together.
Yeah, and what I appreciate about your story about the gentleman, the taxi driver, is that you put your training into action, into practice. We can go through professional developments and through trainings, and we can legislate and change laws and things, but unless we put things into practice and actually apply that knowledge, it doesn't profit us anything. But you chose to put what you learned into practice, and that benefited both you and that taxi driver. And you don't know the countless numbers of other Middle Eastern immigrants who came in, who heard his story that, hey, the police department isn't that bad here in San Diego. The guy was very kind. He even let me call someone so that I make sure I was doing the right thing. So you don't know the impact beyond that conversation that you had, and just by taking time to apply what you had learned. So appreciate that.
And that's exactly what the de-escalation training teaches us, is that it obviously depends on the situation, but we slow things down. And if we can slow things down to be able to just maybe take a breath and go, okay, what do we have here? How can we resolve this problem without having to go hands-on or without having to escalate the situation? Times when we have no choice but to immediately resort to some kind of use of force. That's the nature of the job, and that's the ugly part, I think, that people really don't understand very much. Yet, we've been saddled with a lot of duties that we haven't had before in the past. Like I shared with you before, is that our tactics have changed because we've had to change. With the active shooter scenarios have changed completely the way we respond to these things. And in the past, we would contain a situation and call in a SWAT team, a specialized trained team. But now we've all had to become little mini SWAT teams, because we are the first responders. And when we get there to a situation first where there's an active situation going on, we have to react. We have to react swiftly to be able to contain the situation. Done it very successfully. And like we told you, like I told you the other day too, is that we have been saddled with a lot of society's woes, with all the things that have kind of fallen through the cracks in our lap. And I have to tell you, is we've done actually a very good job of it. I mean, you hear about the bad things, but day in and day out, there are great success stories that probably people don't hear about that save people's lives, whether they talk them out of suicide or system to get help, who are drug addicted. So there's a lot of success stories, and unfortunately, those don't get told often enough to be able to kind of balance the picture.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that through programs like this that we'll be able to share more of those positive stories of what's happening out there, because I agree with you. I believe majority of our police officers have a servant's heart and really want to protect and serve our communities. And I appreciate that. Are there any other things that you think still need to be done to help build positive relationships within our communities of color through various departments, police departments?
Yeah. And actually, it's interesting, because when I shared with you about the ride-along program, I was actually shocked that you didn't know about this. So many agencies in the county do have. I offer to say every agency in the county has a ride-along program. Now, with the COVID situation right now, I know that's probably restricted to downly, but normally if you're interested in riding with a police officer, you just have to call the agency where you live, or it doesn't really matter if you live there or not. You can ride in any agency, and it gives you an opportunity to spend a few hours with a police officer and actually get to ask all the questions you ever had about law enforcement, and you get to see firsthand how officers conduct themselves and do their business. So the implementation of the body-worn camera has really been a game changer for us as well. And it has benefited, at least in my department, has benefited tremendously. It has cut down the rate of complaints, and actually have helped us resolve complaints quicker. It's a great training tool as well. So when we have things go well or things go wrong, we can always use those as training. And like I mentioned to you before, is we also have open houses. So we have people can come and visit the various departments. They usually will send an officer out if you have a community event, and they'll send out an officer with their equipment, and people can see all the equipment that we use and get a kind of an inside look. There's really we're here for the community. I mean, we're all members of the community here. We all have go to school here and everything else. So, our goal as police officers, and I can attest to this because the people I've worked with throughout my career, I have not once worked with somebody or heard of somebody who is outright wants to do harm to people.
Mm-hmm.
It's the absolute opposite. Is that, like I say, you could not survive as a police officer here if you were somebody who was really, really out to hurt people. And it manifests itself very easily. You know who they are, and as a manager myself, we take strides in getting people off the force who do not belong there anymore. Now, granted, we have, like we talked about this too, there's a procedure and there's a policies and there's laws that we have to follow, and not be as swift as people would like it to be, but definitely we are heading that direction of trying to make it a little easier for us to identify and hopefully take care of those who are no longer serving the needs of the community.
Excellent. So there's opportunities for citizens so that their first reactions or interactions, I should say, with police officers can be positive by going on a ride along, inviting police officers or departments to community events, whether it's at your place of worship or at your school or community centers. You can actually invite officers to those events and they'll be glad to share what they do. I know our church had police officers join us for our back to school celebration to help us pass out backpacks and school supplies to children in the community. Very positive interactions with those community officers. And so there's plenty of opportunities for us as citizens to step into the shoes of police officers and also build positive, meaningful relationships with our police officers in our communities. So again, I also, before we close out, I was thinking about also talking with our leaders in our mayors and city councils about funding of programs that help foster and build those relationships early on, especially in education. We had talked about when I grew up, I had pretty positive relationships with police officers because of the DARE program and the safety patrol program in elementary school. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of those programs in secondary schools and middle schools and high schools. And hopefully we can see some funding go into programs like that so that young people can have a consistent relationship with police officers in a positive way. Instead of seeing them as the enforcers, actually see them as a resource to help build positive relationships and understand how they can be safe in their communities. So I'm hoping that we'll see some change there too, and so that young people will have a consistent thread of positive relationships with police officers from elementary all the way through high school and beyond.
I agree. I think we talked about this too, is that the school resource officer program has kind of gotten a bad here, I think, based on things that have happened maybe in other parts of the country. But the vast majority of these programs, at least I can count for here in the county, are very successful in the fact that you have a uniformed officer on campus that people can turn to, maybe look to. And like I said, we've vet the people who we select for these SRO positions very carefully. You don't. It's not something that you just grab somebody and saying, "Hey, guess what? You're now the school resource officer," because you want to make sure you find an officer who will fit that need. So basically, someone who actually cares about kids and understands kids, can relate to kids, and be that positive influence on kids, so that when kids see police officers in uniform, they're not intimidated by them. They know that, hey, we're here to help you. And having an officer on school campuses that kids can turn to and maybe ask questions and saying, hey, at least this has been my experience with the school resource officers that we have, is they're a resource for them, a true resource. They're not the security guards of the school. They're actually there as a resource. And in our case, they teach classes. They teach not similar to DARE, but they teach classes on bullying and other topics that the kids, teenagers especially, go through. It's a tough time to grow up in that, being that age. But the relationship building starts there, so that kids, by the time kids get out of high school, they know, okay, hey, cops aren't bad, you know.
Right.
And like I said too, is as a manager, if you have had a bad experience with a police officer, I really encourage you to report that. And because, you know, we won't know when people misbehave unless somebody tells us. Now, before, what can citizens do? Yeah, if you get pulled over, you know, please be courteous and be respectful, because respect begets respect. Our officers are expected to be very respectful, professional. We have a policy where they have to introduce themselves and let you know why they stopped you. That right away, I think, will eliminate a lot of the anxiety or potential for some kind of an argument or something to escalate. But you know, we have a job to do, and we have a system set up here. If there's a disagreement whether the violation occurred or not, that's why we have the court system set up. But if the officer did not was either disrespectful or rude or some other behavior that maybe was not reflective of the profession that we try to put our best foot forward, let somebody know, and that way at least we can assess that, whether it was just a one-time out or this is a pattern. You know, we're all humans. Sometimes we have bad days, and you know, sometimes unfortunately we take it to work. I think we've all been there before, where some lives that we carry over. As much as we try, and I think one of the reasons why we wear the uniform and when we put the uniform on at work is kind of the don this uniform. You say, okay, now I'm no longer, you know, this person. I'm now a police officer, and I need to get into that mindset and be able to conduct myself professionally and give the best I can.
Yeah, that's it, and that's the key is that we remain professional at all times. As citizens, remain considerate and respectful, and as officers, remaining professional and respectful. And I know you gave me a special little coin here, and on the back of it, it said teamwork, respect, professionalism, and integrity. And if officers are operating with that in mind, the relationships with the citizens and the communities that they protect and serve will be very positive and meaningful moving forward. So thank you again, Captain Waczek, for taking time out of your day to have this important conversation with us. And I hope it motivates others to have these important dialogues across cultures and public service agencies moving forward. Again, in closing, this is The Hard Work, celebrating our racial diversity while building and fostering racial harmony, one conversation at a time. Thank you for tuning in today, and please like and share this program with others. We're just regular people having serious conversations about things that matter to us all. We know that hard work is hard work, but it's not impossible. So until the next conversation, live in peace and be blessed. Take care.
Thanks, Marty.
Thank you.